This is going to be the first it'll be the introduction to my first review of Standing for Truth, Donnie's book, End Times Revealed. So I just want to give I'll give some opening arguments and show where I think the view is right. It's very similar to my view in that it believes it's premillennial, so it believes there's a future 1,000 years, and so there's a future time of tribulation. So I agree with him on most of his arguments against the pre-trib rapture, which it's focused on largely, which I would pretty much agree entirely with the arguments and issues raised in here. The distinction between his view and my view of a future tribulation would be the necessary involvement in the interpretation of passages regarding the Jewish people. Yet, even though his view is largely doesn't see any sort of dispensational distinction, which is an interesting point of reference there. We both believe that there's a worldwide deception of the Antichrist before the rapture. I would argue that his view is like a modified dispensationalism, although I don't think he would like that view. The distinction would be we're both post-tribulation, premillennial. We're both premillennial and we're both post-trib. Some people might think of his view as mid-trib or something, I suppose. But it's really pretty much post-trib. So I'm going to focus on, besides what I agree on regarding, he starts out quoting, I'll be more specific in the next, but this is just an introduction, but I'll just be kind of giving an overview and then I'll be more specific and have an outline. But regarding there being a falling away that comes first, I think that's already happened, but obviously I think that's prior to the return of Christ, the second coming. I agree with him that the dispensationalism is wrong and a sort of full preterism is wrong. Although he's going to argue, we're probably going to mostly agree on what sort of preterist interpretations are correct regarding Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, but we'll cover that later. So I'm going to focus on that, not go over, I'll agree where I can. I'm going to disagree. There's going to be disagreement over the interpretation of Daniel's 70th week. I take the classic messianic interpretation of I'm a historical premillennialism. My main contentions are going to be the ways I think his view ends up being pretty much have similar issues to dispensational views, which agree that the 70th week is future, which I think is the root of the problem. And kind of this pseudo splitting up of the second coming, even though he's going to argue that there isn't two comings because it's kind of the pre-trib view, pre-trib rapture view, which separates the church and Israel, which he only does to a minor degree. And then I'm going to give one argument to start with here to get started. And that would be issues with 2 Thessalonians. And so I'm going to argue that there's when Jesus comes, which is the resurrection, fates are decided for all people. So his view looks like this. I'll show the chart. You can buy his book if you want on his channel, from his channel. I'm not going to make it so people can see the whole thing, but let's look at the first chart. Let's see. Did I pass it? I think I might have passed it. There it is. Okay. Come on. So I don't believe there's a 7-year tribulation. I just believe there's a tribulation, and the Bible doesn't say. There is no verse in the New Testament that says there's a 7-year tribulation. There's only literal interpretations of the time periods in Daniel's 70th or in Daniel 7 and Daniel 12, and then how it's used in Revelation 11, 12, 13, or whatever. I don't think those are literal. I'll cover that in one of the review segments. But this is essentially his view. Pre-trib, pre-wrath, post-trib. I think that distinction is somewhat meaningless. It's just two, but it does separate my view from his, although I don't think we go through the wrath. So that's one point of contention, the 7 years, which is, I think, is where the dispensational issue derives. And this is kind of a half and half of the historical sort of premillennial futurism, if you want to call it that. Is futurism all dispensational? Well, my view is historical. Can you be a historic premill without being a futurist? I think so. But I think many of these fulfillments are historical between Christ's ascension and our current place in history. Cover that later. So one argument I'm going to make about this pre-wrath distinction here is because he wants to say they're a part of the 7 years, which I think is not necessarily specified. He thinks that represents literal 3.5 years in a 7-year period of Daniel's 70th week. I think the 70th week is in the past, but I'm not a preterist. So I think there is a future time of tribulation. It's not specified how long in the New Testament. The time periods, which have to do with 42 months, 1,260 days, 1,290, 1,335 literal days that he would take. I don't think that fits a literal Jewish calendar, and because it doesn't. So it's not literal because those time periods don't fit on a literal Jewish calendar. So I don't know what they would say to that. Another thing, so here's my one argument I'll make, and then next time I'm going to go into looking at the verses of Jesus' second coming, and if they fit where there's a resurrection in any sort of tribulation that continues on the earth after. I'm super post-trib. When the tribulation's over, all fates are decided of human beings on the earth. There is no anything going on after that. And the things he puts all crammed into the future, I think much of it has been fulfilled throughout history, not in the first century. They're historically fulfilled over longer periods of time, stretching down to our time, which I think is the time of the end before Christ's soon return. So here's the one argument I'll make. Let's see. I think this verse is almost like the killer proof text to the distinction of his view versus mine, considering we're both post-trib, premillennial. And that is Isaiah. Next time I'll be more organized. Isaiah 20. Let's see. I think it's 20. It better be this one. 26. Okay. Isaiah 26, 19, and 20. Your dead shall live, together with my dead body they shall arise. Awake and sing, you who dwell in the dust, for your dew is like the dew of herbs, and the earth shall cast out the dead. This is obviously a resurrection passage, one of the few in the Old Testament. Take refuge from the coming judgment. Okay. Let's see. Make it so you can see the whole thing here. Come, my people, enter your chambers and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourself, as it were, for a little moment until the indignation is past. Behold, the Lord comes out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth will also disclose her blood, and will no more cover her slain. So when does this happen? Sounds like it's the judgment and a resurrection, but also God executing some sort of judgment. What do I think that looks like? Well, I think I guess I'll give one or two more arguments. Whatever they're saying, Paul is saying, or Peter is saying, or anybody is saying, they're echoing what Jesus taught. So when Paul says something like, to the audience of Christians and the watching world, if you will, that Jesus is the coming judge that you need to be ready for, that's for everybody, Jew and Gentile. So we waiting for him from heaven who raised him from the dead, even Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. We're both going to agree on that. But well, I don't believe when Jesus comes, it's the final judgment of the lake of fire. I do believe those who oppose God and worship the beast, we see here that concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, he's talking to believers in the Messiah of the new covenant and our gathering together to him, not shaken in mind or troubled in spirit by word or letter from us, so that the day of Christ had come. That day will not come till he uses this in his book. I agree with that, but I think he doesn't keep going and say that the Lord comes and he destroys the Antichrist with the brightness of his coming and the breath of his mouth. So, well, maybe there's an interval right there. Maybe this is maybe we should split this up. Like, this is Jesus coming back with the saints. The problem with that is this is the time of tribulation under the Antichrist, and Jesus comes to destroy the Antichrist at his coming. And if we look at, well, first I'll show this verse. Revelation 13:8. Speaking from Daniel 7, the same individual that Paul's speaking of in the verse we just looked at. Authority was given to him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. Tribe, tongue, and nation. That's all the different peoples of the earth. We use that sort of language to refute racist versions of, like, Black Hebrew Israelites, for instance. That's a reference to all peoples. It was granted him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. It's temporary, right? And all who dwell on the earth will worship him, the Antichrist. All who dwell on the earth, every tribe, tongue, and nation, all who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Notice what Jesus says. I think is it 19? 21. He who is unjust, let him be unjust still. He who is filthy, let him be filthy still. He who is righteous, let him be righteous still. He who is holy, let him be holy still. And behold, I'm coming quickly. This is Jesus speaking, and my reward is with me. You could say swiftly. He comes suddenly, sort of thing, like a thief in the night. That's what that means, quickly. It means swiftly, more, or at least can mean that. So when this was written in the first century, the second century, if you want to say that, but it's first century, it's talking about a future event that happens suddenly, quickly. And my reward is with me to give to everyone according to his work. Everyone. Every man in the King James, I think. I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. Think about that. He's the one from the very beginning, and he's the one at the last. So this reflects what we have going on in Revelation 14. There is a final claim to the world, a final message to the everlasting gospel of salvation in Jesus. The angel signifies a message. Flying in the midst of heaven means it's sweeping the earth. The final warning to be made right with God through Christ. It has the everlasting gospel to preach to all who dwell on the earth. So this is obviously before the mark of the beast is implemented, but it's the final warning. Some people think they're giving that message, in fact, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people. See that language? Saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. Has come. This is being preached before the mark of the beast falls. Otherwise, it's pointless because he who is filthy, let him be filthy still. So the mark of the beast, there's a warning. Well, before Jesus returns, when people can still get saved, before all those who worship the beast, except those whose names have the Father's name written on their forehead, except for those who are, everybody's written in the Lamb's book of life, slain from the foundation of the world. That means they're under the salvation of Christ. Everyone else is worshiping the beast. And we know everyone who worships the beast was thrown into the lake of fire. It's a guarantee. So if there's a time of tribulation with the Antichrist that's enforcing the mark of the beast, the judgment is happening before Jesus returns as a warning. Then people take the mark of the beast. Then Jesus returns to give to every man according to his work. Let he who is filthy be filthy, and he who is in Christ and he who is not in Christ be what they are. That's what that means. And then he comes and executes the separation. That's what that means. Because the one who makes them worship the beast, that makes them go to hell or makes them lost for certain. And then Jesus says as a warning in the first century to all who read his words, the prophecy of this book says, surely I'm coming quickly. That prophecy is to be part of the call to be reconciled to God before the judgment comes. And when that judgment comes when Jesus returns. And when Jesus returns, fates are decided according to what I just read. Because everyone's worshiping the beast that's alive on earth, except for those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life from the foundation of the world, which is salvation. So, and that fits with what we read in 2 Thessalonians 2. So how can there be some sort of time where other stuff is happening and the wrath is falling? Just seems like Isaiah 26 doesn't allow it. So that's my question. Can people be saved after I guess maybe not. I guess that's the point. So, but and then let me tie it together because that may work with his view, but it's kind of just putting the picture together. But now let's with that in mind, let's look at what does Jesus say in Matthew 13 when he interprets the harvest? There's a harvest, right? So the harvest is at the end of the age, the reapers are the angels. And he sends at the end of the age, the Son of Man will send out his angels and they'll gather up his kingdom all things that offend and those who practice lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. They're damned, in other words. So that happens. Notice the lawlessness language. Who offend and practice lawlessness. And 2 Thessalonians 2, regarding this Antichrist figure, is the man of lawlessness, the lawless one, who brings the lie, the apostasy. God sends a strong delusion so that they believe the lie. So he's separating them. And so, seems to me, then we go to Matthew. Here's the last point here. If Jesus destroys the Antichrist at his coming, and at the same time, let's see. Notice lawlessness abounding and the love of many grows cold, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. Seems like that's like what endure in what? Not to be led astray by false prophets preaching lawlessness. And so the love of many grows cold. And then some of them fall away into apostasy. That's the idea. And the lawlessness is the commandments. Sorry, the love. If you love me, keep my commandments. Lawlessness, the man of lawlessness. But if you endure in love and you don't follow the man of sin who seeks to change God's times and laws, you'll endure. but lawlessness abounding will cause the love of many to wax cold, and they'll fall away because they'll lose their first love. But the gospel of the will be preached in all the world as witness to the nations. Let's see. Okay, and so, and then there's the whole application of the Sabbath still existing, which some people say has changed. Like somebody said, apparently Paul is the Antichrist or Jesus is the Antichrist because apparently he tried to change God's law, which can't be changed, but which is what the Antichrist does in Daniel 7. Whoopsie. Sorry. 1 second. Okay. So, let's see. So this part right here. But that day now known as with the angels in heaven, but as the days of Noah were, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also, let's see. So it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be standing in the field. One will be taken, the other left. Who's taken? Who was taken? Who in the flood? The lost were taken away. The flood came and took them all away. So in this text, the one left is the one judged. The one standing in the field, the one left here is the one not judged. The flood takes them away. So if all the people are taken away, just like it says in Matthew 13, sends forth. So in other words, it's simultaneous at Jesus coming that he first sends out his angels to take out everything that practices lawlessness and is associated with the mark of the beast. It's simultaneous. So is that pre-wrath? No, it's contemporaneous with the wrath. But of course you don't like suffer it. It's not the tribulation. So it seems to me this is, well, let's look at it one more time just to sum it up here. Here's the argument. Jesus is coming to harvest the earth and to do the winepress of God. That's the imagery. So, is that right? Notice the sower language. He's like, it's his threshing floor, right? He has a sickle in his mouth. He shoves it in the earth. So it is a rapture of the saints that are resurrected, but it's also simultaneously destroying the Antichrist and all those that worship the beast. It happens at the same time, according to all these texts, when you read them all the way through. And don't just cherry pick and so it seems like a problem for that view that says there's like another year of tribulation or whatever. It also seems like a problem that the man of sin is in the temple of a rebuilt Jerusalem temple. The man of sin is an apostasy in the church because the church has been established already. And since we know that the church is a continuation of Israel because he establishes the church with Israel with their new covenant for them. Of course, if you believe Daniel's 70th week is future, it puts Jesus' death outside of the 70 weeks allotted so that his death brings the new covenant by his blood, according to him. This is the blood of the covenant that I pour out for you, and they do communion. That's him in his impending death, and in his death it ratifies the covenant. So he does actually establish the new covenant according to this, that he died and was buried and rose according to the scriptures. Well, according to the scriptures, the only way to make reconciliation for iniquity is Jesus being the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. But the third thing in Daniel 9:24 that has to be accomplished to make reconciliation for iniquity, which is what ends up ratifying the covenant, is Jesus, that thing has to happen within the 70 weeks allotted by God. 70 weeks are determined to put an end to sin, anoint the most holy, all that, and make reconciliation for iniquity. That word is kippur, like Yom Kippur. And we know that Jesus' death ends up ratifying the covenant, which is he dies for the sins of the world. And so that has to happen in the 70 weeks. But if you put the 70th week into the future, verse 29-25 says he's cut off after the 69th week. After it. After. Jesus is cut off after the 69 weeks are over. After. And so if the 70th week didn't start after the 69th, and you put a gap that's not part of the 70 weeks prophecy, which is not justified at all, just because it speaks of the 70 weeks in sections, doesn't say anything about a gap. I can talk about the first 10 years of my life, the second 20 years of my life, which is the first 30 years of my life. If I told you, oh, I'm 30 years old, and I remember on my 10th birthday, I did this, that, and the other. And then the next 20 years of my life, this, that, and the other in my job, and I lived here, there, and the other. And then you look at my birth certificate, and I'm actually 40. And you said, dude, you said you're 30. And then I say, well, yeah, I told you there was this, I was 10, and then I had a birthday. That's a piece of the 30. And then I've lived 20 more years. And I'm 40 years old, but I mean, there's obviously a gap in there because I mentioned the first 10 and then the next 20 years. So that obviously there's a 10-year gap. I mean, because I told you I was 10 and then 20 more years happened. And everybody who's 40 years old is 30 years old. Everyone who's 31 is 30 years old. Everyone who's 32 is 30 years old. Everyone who's 37 years old is also 30 years old. Duh, there's a gap. That's a gap, obviously, right? No, that's stupid. There's no gap. And if you did put a gap in, let's say we allow it, which is stupid, and it's a dispensational idea because it's forced, and they still can't get the timeline right because they take the time periods literal, and they're not listed in literal increments. They're listed in prophetic lunar reckoning, which they don't use. They don't use it now. They didn't use it at any time in history. From now back until the first century. They didn't use it in the first century. From the first century back to when Daniel wrote the prophecy, they weren't using a lunar calendar. Never have. And they weren't using a lunar calendar when they were in captivity in Babylon, and neither was Babylon. So the lunar calendar rendering maybe was used in the days of Noah, but when Daniel wrote the prophecy, and from the first 69 weeks to when Jesus showed up, and from then until now, they've never ever used a calendar that is based on lunar rendering. But the time period listed are actual historical time that was to tell the Jews when things would happen. So no, they're not literal, just like the 70 weeks aren't literal time. They're a day for a year. And so you can't make that work if it's literal, because this first 69 weeks, which represent years, 490 years, there's 483 years from the decree to Jesus showing up at the end of the 69th week. 3.5 years later, he's cut off. If he didn't get cut off in the 70th week, which is what comes after 60, then he died outside of the 70 weeks. But 70 weeks are determined to make reconciliation for iniquity. And so Jesus, if he died in a gap, which means it's outside of the time period because it's on pause, then he didn't die in the 70 weeks. So his death can't make the atonement for the iniquity as set forth by Scripture. And then therefore he doesn't die according to the Scriptures, which is the gospel. They tell me, 1 Corinthians 15, that he died according to the Scriptures, which would mean he dies in the 70 weeks if his death makes atonement for iniquity, which ratifies the covenant, which is what the New Testament teaches. So there's that, but nobody cares. Some views can be falsified easily if you just believe what the Bible teaches. I don't mean to be rude, but it's like nobody cares. They just they don't accept blatant evidence. So there's that whole thing, but then there's Jesus executing judgment on everyone at his return. There is nothing after that except for the millennium, which remains to be determined what that looks like. But it certainly doesn't look like people on earth that get a second chance. When it says Jesus through his entire ministry is saying, make sure you're watching, make sure you're ready, because you know not when your master comes. And then the New Testament writers say we wait for Jesus to return from heaven and save us from the wrath to come. The resurrection of the dead and the saving of the saints. See, all the earth say, oh my God, we see the sign of the Son of Man. It's too late. Some people try to get oil. They can't, they're not ready because they didn't care. They said all things continue as they have from the beginning of creation. And then they say peace and safety. Everything's cool. Let's marry whoever we want, however we want. Let's get drunk. And they say, it's never rained before. And then suddenly, the thief in the night is the people who aren't ready. Jesus says, be ready. There's no, he comes back and then life goes on and people no, when he comes back, all the saints are resurrected from the dead or they're transformed into their immortal bodies. All the wicked are killed with the Antichrist because they worship the beast. And then at the end of the 1,000 years, they're resurrected unto final judgment in the lake of fire, which is the second death. When the city comes down out of heaven after the 1,000 years were through. And Satan's released from his prison because he's been stuck on the earth with all the people that were serving the Antichrist have been killed with the Antichrist. And all the saints have been resurrected and transformed into immortal bodies and taken to heaven. And they don't come back till the 1,000 years are through. And that's when Satan's released from his prison in the wilderness of a destroyed earth, as prophesied by Jeremiah 4, which is a chiasmic sort of structure to like the without form and void prior to the original creation. There'll be that before on the earth prior to the recreation. And the earth will rest. It'll get its Sabbath rest that nobody gave it on earth. All the humans that negated God's Sabbath. The earth will rest the Sabbath. And Satan will be stuck in the wilderness. But when Jesus returns and the holy city descends out of heaven and the New Jerusalem comes to settle on an earth where it's a recreated, restored earth with the saints and no more sin and suffering. And by the way, hellfire happens on the surface of the earth, which is where the saints dwell forever. And all the wicked are stubble. They're left neither root nor branch. You'll look for their place and you won't find it. They'll be as though they never were. Like smoke, they'll vanish away. Because when the New Jerusalem comes out of heaven and Jesus raises all the wicked, all the unsaved people to mortal life so they can face the final judgment, that's when Satan is quote unquote released, because now he has people to gather for his purposes. And he gathers them from the four corners of the earth, and they surround the holy city, come down out of heaven, and they encompass the saints round about, all the saints of all history in the city. And they try to take the city because there's weeping and gnashing of teeth outside of the city. And Satan gathers them and they attack, and fire comes down out of heaven and devours them. That's the final judgment of the lost, an eternal destruction from the Lord, fire from the Lord from heaven. Because they were dead before Jesus comes back with the saints, because they died when Jesus came because they were worshiping the beast. But all people who are lost are in that group, Gog and Magog. And the thing with Satan that everybody's confused about, he's been in the wilderness, stuck on the earth by himself with the fallen angels. And it's when Christ returns with the people and they see the wickedness of these people that Satan gathers, and they try to take the city. And of course, they're judged and destroyed in the final judgment. That's what happens. So there's no millennium on earth. There's no 1,000 years on the earth. It's a misapplication. And heaven does come to rest on earth. Jesus comes back from heaven. But you have to be ready. The whole thrust of the New Testament is that Jesus is judge, and he warns for you to be ready and in him before he does. There's a coming judgment. It's in Acts. Nowhere in Acts do they warn about eternal conscious torment. But they do say that what Jesus said, that Jesus is God's righteous judge, as he's proved himself. He's ascended into heaven. In like manner, he's coming back. And when he does, his reward is with him to give to every man. And everyone who worships the beast is thrown into the lake, will end up in the lake of fire at the end of the 1,000 years. But, and it says that man of sin, the man of lawlessness, is allowed to have dominion and over the whole earth, all the earth, every tribe, tongue, and nation worships him, whose names are not written in the Lamb's Book of Life, which would include everybody from history that is saved in Jesus is in that group. Most of them are dead. And there'll be some who are alive, and they'll be transformed, but they won't precede those who have fallen asleep. So there is no wrath happening with judgments and all that. Jesus executes the judgment at his coming. I guess that's not really an introduction, is that it's a whole thing.